In this lecture, we will be reviewing the work of Dr. James H. Strong, a leading authority in educational effectiveness. The reading materials from last week came from his book, Qualities of Effective Teachers. And this book provides an evidence-based framework that identifies the characteristics shared by successful teachers across different grade levels and subjects. We're going to dig into what makes a teacher truly effective, not just popular, but impactful with the students in the classroom. His work is organized into several different categories. You see those here on the screen. As we go through this lecture, we will be digging into each of these, but know that his research shows that each of these pieces plays an important role in how effective a classroom teacher is in his or her classroom. Let's look at the teacher as a person. This category emphasizes personal qualities that affect teaching and learning. Dr. James Strong's work emphasized the idea that effective teachers are caring and empathetic. They are fair to students in the classroom and they show respect. They are enthusiastic and they are motivated to be in the classroom. Effective teachers are also highly reflective in their practices. And a key indicator of an effective teacher is that they have high expectations for all students. Content knowledge is also very rich, and they have a grasp on what they're teaching, and they also understand how to teach it. So they really have taken the theory and the practice, and they're able to use both of those pieces to create successful, impactful learning experiences. The other piece we see from his research is that they are lifelong learners. In other words, if something doesn't work with students, they are seeking out other research-based means to be effective. Why does this characteristic matter? Well, we know that students are more likely to engage and succeed when they feel supported, respected, and inspired by their teacher. Classroom management and instruction, or organization. An effective teacher establishes a safe, orderly environment that is conducive to learning. What we see is that there are clear rules and routines. We also see that discipline is consistent. In other words, a teacher will discipline one student as they will discipline another student. Effective teachers also use time in the classroom and space very well. Their lessons move at a pace, there's no downtime, and again, that effective use of time and space also helps to prevent disruptions. Why does this category matter in the classroom? Well, what we know is that time lost to misbehavior is time lost for learning. And a well-managed classroom maximizes instructional time. Now, classroom management tends to be the one area in a first year, second year, third year teacher's classroom where they may struggle. So this is an area that when you get to classroom management and instruction, the course in your learning sequence, you need to really pay attention to how to pick up tips and tricks and things to do to help manage your classroom. The effective teacher knows how to organize instruction in meaningful and powerful ways. What does Dr. James Strong's research show about this characteristic? Well, an effective teacher designs lessons for student mastery. They may not happen at the end of every lesson. For instance, students may be continually working on the writing process, but every lesson that is designed is moving students towards that end of year goal that states the student should be able to write a sentence or whatever the goals may be. And again, an effective teacher is organizing instruction around clear learning goals. They know what students need to know and be able to do at the end of each lesson, and they also understand what are the goals for each instructional unit that they've developed their lessons around. So they know exactly those learning targets that students should be able to demonstrate. They also organize instruction by using a variety of resources. They're not just showing students videos, or they're not just lecturing to students, but instead they are carefully planning this instruction to be engaging, and different uses of materials and different ways of seeing content so that students are learning from those experiences. The other piece that we see from the literature is that an effective teacher organizes instruction in such a way that they are able to differentiate for the diverse learners that sit in their classroom. Now, as a novice teacher, differentiation is a challenging way of designing instruction, particularly as it pertains to the readiness. What are students ready to learn? This means that teachers must be using assessment data to plan and drive their instructional decisions. For novice teachers, this can take some time, but when we look at things like interest-based choices, or maybe putting in different modalities. Modalities is an area that the research is not as strong on, that says that students really are kinesthetic, visual, auditory learners. But again, by thinking about incorporating different means of presenting material, it will help to reach all of your students. But again, effective teachers are well versed in how do I plan this lesson to reach all of my students. In terms of implementing, so an effective teacher has planned instruction on paper, and now they are implementing that instruction. And so what we know is that effective teachers use those proven research-based practices in their lessons, and they've incorporated those strategies, questioning, discussions. They're using maybe cooperative learning pieces, so students are first talking to each other, then talking to the teacher and sharing information. That lesson has visuals, demonstrations. The teacher is modeling how to problem solve, how to work through math problems, whatever it may be that they want the students to know and do by the end of the lesson. Implementing instruction is we see that effective teachers are using their time well, their clarity in explanations. Why does this matter? Well, we know that good delivery helps students stay focused, understand the content, and apply their learning. So this may mean that as a new teacher, you might have to be practicing your instruction in a bathroom. How you might have to be developing a script that you put on a clipboard that helps you to walk through. What are you doing first? What are you doing next? There's nothing wrong as a new teacher with keeping your lesson plan on a clipboard, but you need to have gone over it before you're sitting in that classroom so that you're not having to look at it, that you know. Maybe you're building a PowerPoint that actually walks you through that lesson, that day's different subjects if you're in elementary, or if you're a secondary teacher, you're developing a PowerPoint that walks through what you're going to do in each of the bells that you're teaching, especially if you're differentiating between maybe you're teaching an honors level course as opposed to just a regular level course. But again, implementing instruction, it is seamless, there's not a lot of downtime, and you're using your classroom time effectively. When we look at monitoring student progress, effective teachers assess, track, and adjust. Again, I'll say that again. Effective teachers assess students, they track student data, and they're adjusting their instruction based off of the data that they're collecting. So this means they're using formative data. They're using exit tickets. They're using quizzes. They're using self-checks, maybe reflective writing from the students. And those formative assessments are done at the end of each lesson, and it provides you as the teacher with data to make instructional decisions. And then at some point in your unit sequence, you are doing a summative assessment. Maybe you're doing a small test, or maybe at the end of the unit, you have a test, but you also have a performance task that your students are doing to demonstrate their understanding. But that data that you're collecting is used by you to make instructional decisions, which means you must be giving feedback to your students in a timely manner, and that feedback needs to be very constructive. So in other words, if we're working on writing, I'm going to be constructive in my points that I give to the students. I like the way that you use adjectives in this sentence to describe your nouns. I would like to see more different words in your sentence, or I'm seeing that you're using too many run-on sentences. We need to work on being succinct in our writing. So you're giving very constructive but very pointed feedback so that students know exactly what they're doing well and what they need to improve upon. We also know that when we are going over and giving students feedback, it has a positive impact on student achievement. We also know that effective teachers are monitoring and using assessment data for and of student learning, but at the end of the unit, they're using that summative data to also say, here is what I know my students know and can do at this point, and here is what they still need to work on. So here's where they've grown, and here's what they still need to work on. And an effective teacher builds a plan of how they're going to get their students where they need to be by the end of the year. An effective teacher is professional. So what does this mean? Well, research shows that an effective teacher reflects on teaching practices and seeks improvement. They're not afraid to ask for help. They also are maintaining professional relationships with colleagues, students, and with families. What does that mean? Well, that means with students, I am the teacher and they are the students. I am not their friend. I am not seeking that they like me. I'm going to have to, perhaps, talk to students about their behaviors because they may do something in the classroom that impacts learning for the other students in that classroom. I need to be able to have those conversations, and I'm not worried about them liking me. I'm going to be professional. I'm going to explain what I need them to be doing, and I'm going to be putting in practices that help to get the behaviors that I would like to see. I'm also, in terms of colleagues, I am being professional with my colleagues. I'm not gossiping. I'm not talking bad about other teachers. I'm not being disgruntled against my administration. So when we think about what Scripture talks about not grumbling. These are the things that when we do those pieces, when we engage in gossip with our peers, when we aren't willing to go to an administrator and to say to them, I'm not understanding this decision that you made. Can you help me understand why we're having to do these things in this way? But when we grumble behind the scenes, it does nothing but create a negative atmosphere in that building. And our role as Christian educators is to be salt and to light. And we should be enriching, we should be flavoring the atmosphere that we're placed with positivity, and we should be willing to go and have those hard conversations about things that we may not agree on. With families, I am sending home positive information. When I call home to share a concern about a student, I'm using, I've heard it said many different ways, the sandwich method or the Oreo method. I'm starting with a positive, and then I'm bringing my concerns up, and then I'm ending on a positive note. I'm communicating often with families, with parents. I'm not waiting for behavior to have happened several times in the classroom before I call home and seek for help from mom or dad or whoever is the guardian. I am in communication with parents, and I'm communicating often because parents, guardians, they are those folks that we come alongside and we work to help to make sure that child is successful. But I'm communicating with parents. I am not communicating information online. I'm not putting things out that are derogatory. I am being as positive as I can about the profession of teaching. Teaching is a hard profession, and there are days where it's challenging and it's tough. But again, if I am following what Scripture teaches me, then I should be looking to be positive and encouraging and uplifting in the place that God has placed me. I'm also making sure that I'm not sharing sensitive information, and that's that ethical behavior. The other piece that I think that goes along with professionalism is that as believers placed in the classroom, we are to be praying for our students and praying for their parents, their guardians. Prayer goes a long way in terms of changing the atmosphere. So I highly encourage you to be praying over your students' desks before they walk into that classroom so that you are seeking to invite the Lord into your classroom. So why are we working so tirelessly here at Regent University to train you to be an effective teacher? Well, that's because what we know is that what you do in the classroom makes a difference. If you're not prepared to deliver a lesson, if you don't know your content, if you aren't creating instruction that's engaging for students and therefore disruptions are on the rise, then we know that impacts children's learning. We know that the research shows that what you do in the classroom makes long-lasting impacts on student growth. We see it in the data with poor and minority students. Unfortunately, they are the first to suffer the effects of ineffective teaching. Now, what the data shows us is that children, for the most part, in kindergarten come fairly equal, even if they come from a home where they're often not read to or they're not spoken with. In other words, they're talked at, but parents in that home aren't having conversations with children. What we see is that the gap widens in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, when they are exposed to ineffective teaching. And this is why it makes a difference. We can take a child who comes from a very chaotic home with not a lot of reading, and we can provide them a rich classroom environment that can actually help them to learn to read, and then we can help them to learn those skills and those things that then take them to first grade and second grade. Effective teaching matters. Even with high gifted students, so high achieving students, we will see that they show adequate growth only with high effective teachers. So think about now you have a gifted student who's in an ineffective teacher's classroom. They're not going to grow. Even though they are bright, they are going to stay exactly the same until they come in contact with an effective teacher. But they're going to still have the effects of that lost year. This is why what you do matters. This is why the practices that we are trying to instill in you, lesson planning, being reflective, classroom management, use of instructions, strategies to help you manage a positive classroom. This is why we're teaching you all of these things so that when you go to student teaching, you can practice them. And then when you get your job, you will be already moving towards being an effective teacher in the classroom. The other reason that we care is that you are going to impact lots and lots and lots of children in your practice. Let's just take for a moment that you teach 25 students your first year, and then you have 25 students the next and the next. Let's say you teach for 30 years. That's over 750 students for an elementary teacher. Now let's think about that from a secondary perspective. So you have 25 students in a class and you're teaching 4 sections. That's 100 students every year that you're teaching times 30. That's 3,000 students that you will encounter over your professional career. Those students are important. They're going to go out into the world. And by the time students graduate, they should be able to read. They should be able to find truth, to be able to discern what is information, what's not. These are all things that we have a chance to teach them. Here's what we know. We have an example in Scripture that shows us the characteristics that we see in Dr. James Strong's work. Jesus was the master teacher. Now, I know that he also had the knowledge of God. And so when he interacted with people in his encounters, he had information about them. I often think about the woman at the well. He knew her life story. But regardless, what we see is that Jesus used parables and stories. He used different ways to reach different people. He pitched things with the expectation that they could figure it out and that they would be able to understand what he was talking about. He spoke truth and he refuted error. And all throughout his teaching, we see that he asked lots and lots of questions with the people that he encountered. So we see evidence of these characteristics that we want to see in effective teachers. Dr. Strong's research shows that effective teaching is not a mystery. It is observable, learnable, and repeatable. Effective teachers build relationships. They plan and deliver with clarity their instruction. They reflect and they grow in their practices. And they maintain high standards for themselves and for their students. So, as we end, think about these categories that we talked about today. What do you think is your strongest area? What areas might you need to further develop? And what will you do this week, next week, in this course? What are the steps that you will take to becoming a more effective teacher?